Hello, welcome to another video. In this video, I'll be showcasing a library that I have been working on, and I recently completed a working version of it. So the aim of the library is to do Android validation, right? So a lot of times you have forms that you have in your application, and then taking data from them, you have to write, a lot of activity code to first of all validate the data and then collect the data before doing whatever you do with it, whether you send it to a server or you store it in a database. So the point of this library or the aim of this library is to simplify that process, right? And you'll see what I mean in just a bit. Okay, so let us create a new Android project to demonstrate this application. So we will call this application a form app, right? So the aim of this is not to create a fully functional, logical application, but just to show you how you can use the library, right? So form app. So the minimum API version for this library is actually API 21 Lollipop. So maybe in the future I might work on some uh, version for 21 or below 21, but for now it's 21, so we'll select that. So you will create an empty activity called, I don't know, let's just leave it as main activity, right? And we'll click finish. So we will give the project some time to set up, and then we'll be good to go. So whilst it's setting up, let me just open a tab and then show you the library. So I have currently hosting the library on Jetpack. So Jetpack is basically a service that helps you link repositories you have on like GitHub or Bitbucket, and so it sort of does a quick build and then sends it to any application that is taking it, right? So the library, this is the GitHub repo containing the library. So I'll just look this up, and then you can see that there's a version 0.1.0. So if I click get it, so it basically gives me all the commands I should put in my Gradle files. Right, so in the root build.gradle, we'll put the Maven entry into the all projects, and then in our dependencies we will copy and paste this implementation. Okay. So our application is almost set up. Okay, so at this point I have access to the Gradle scripts, right? So like we said in the instructions over here, I have to add this entry to my all projects section. So I will go to the first build.gradle. So you can see it says project over here. So that's the project level Gradle file. So you can see the all projects over here. So I will copy and paste that. Okay, so once we have that, I can go to my app level Gradle file and copy this implementation, right? Paste it over here. Okay, good. So now that we are done with that, we'll click sync now for it to get the project, the library into the project. Okay. So that is successful. So we can minimize this and then continue. So essentially we just so sorry, I have a bit of a sore throat. We've just imported the library Android validation component version 0.1.0 into the application, right? Cool. So let's go to the main activity and then create a form using the components in that library, and then we'll come to the activity to demonstrate how simple it is, right? So the main activity will simply contain the form that we'll be using, and then when we gather all the data, we'll simply send it to another activity to be viewed. So just a simple application. Okay, So let's switch to text. So I will change the root component from a constraint layout to a linear layout with an orientation of vertical. So I will just give a little padding at the top. So padding top, say 8 dp, and then padding bottom as well. Sorry. Okay, so we can take out this text view because we will not be needing it. So there are 4 components that exist in the validation components. Right, there's the validatable edit text, validatable radio group, validatable checkbox, and then also validatable spinner. Right, so these are similar to their Android-based components. So edit text is for typing input, a spinner is for selecting something from a very long list. Radio button or radio groups are also for selecting items, but for shorter lists. And then checkboxes are checkboxes. Okay. So let's create a few fields over here, right? So we would have com dot project is digital analogy. Okay, so you can see we have the validatable edit text, right? So we have that there. Okay, so we have to add the width. We'll set to match parent, and the height we will set it to wrap content. And you can see we have a nice little rounded edit text over there, right? Okay, so let's give it an ID so that we'll be able to identify it in the layout. So I will call this first name input, right? So now the point of the library is that it removes or it brings majority of the form setup into the XML so that you don't have to type too much code in your activity, right? So essentially, if we wanted a label for this, I would add the label attribute, and then as I type, you can see it appears over there. So it appears as a hint inside the edit text, right? And then I will specify the form name, right? So essentially, if you know about how post data works in HTTP, essentially you would give, or even HTML, your input attributes, you will give them the name attribute. So when the data is going to the server, the name goes with the value that you've typed into it, right? So the name here is the form name here is akin to the name in HTML input tags, right? So I would specify this as first name, and then we can set whether this field is required. So if it is required and then we haven't put in a value, during validation it will fail and then it will inform the activity. So I'll set the required. So by default it's false, so you set it to true if you want it to be required. So if it's required and validation also has failed, you'd want an error message to be shown or displayed, right? So we'll add the last attribute here called the error. So I'll put in first name is required. So as you can see, quite simple, right? So over in your activity, all you need to do is pass in sort of the container to this component, and it will put the value inside for you. So let's create a few more fields. So we will call this last name input. I will change this to last. Also change this to last name. So it's also required. Let's give it a bit of a margin at the top. Right. And then we will have other names. So usually other names, people can just have first name, last name. Other name is not a required component, so we will put this. We'll set the required to false, so we'll just remove it from there entirely. So in other words, if this field is not required, even if you haven't put in any value inside, it will still pass the validation. So that makes the error redundant, because it will never show an error. So I will change this to other names. right? So I would just add a bit of margin to the top. Okay, so nicely done, right? Good. So we've seen how to use the validatable edit text, right? So let's see how the validatable radio group works. So a radio group is usually used when you are selecting from a small list, right? So a good example like that would be something like marital status, right? So to work with radio groups here, traditionally you type the radio group and then you put radio buttons inside. But with validation, Android validation components, what you do is that you will specify the um, the radio buttons we want to put inside a radio group as a string array, and then we will pass it into it and it will populate that for us. So traditionally, if you're using Android radio group, right, it would have something like this, and then we'll put in radio buttons inside. So match parents, wrap content, text, maybe A or something like that. So that's how you would use the traditional Android radio group. But with validation components, let's head over to the strings.xml. Let's create a string array. So we will call this marital status labels. Right, so we will put in an item of maybe single, married, divorced, and then widowed. Right, so this is the labels, but for the actual value, so we kind of create labels and then the corresponding values and pass both into the validatable radio group. Right, so you would have, so you can see it will reduce the size of your XML significantly. So values we'll have here. So again, this is similar to the way you do it in HTML, right? So you'd have each of your radio buttons has a name and then a corresponding value. So the values are basically these, right? So going back to activity.xml, I would now use the validatable radio group, right? So I will take this away and yeah. So again, let's give it an ID of I don't know, marital status select, right? So now to specify, we will also give it a form name as well. So maybe marital status. So we will need to specify the labels. So that's the entry labels you are seeing there. So we'll specify the one we created in the string.xml. Right, so that will be the labels, and then we will also specify entry values as the marital status values. And you can see automatically we have that over there. You can see quite simple to use. So to also give it a label, we will use the label attributes and say marital status. Right? So you can see. So with this one, with the radio group, the value that will be given is whatever value you have selected. Right? So if you say you selected married, since married is the second element in the labels, it will pick the second element in the values and then present it as the value. You can see, quite simple. Right? So let's also look at the validatable spinner. So spinner is similar to, or similar in functionality to a radio group, except that you'd use that if your list items are a lot. Right? So maybe nationality will be a good example of that. Sorry. So we would put in a spinner, tell it to match parents and wrap content. So with the custom attributes, the spinner takes the same things a radio group also takes, right? So let's go here and then create two more arrays. So and let's just call this value labels. we'll just change this to, random stuff. Point is that, um, so the idea here is that the sizes of the labels and the corresponding values have to match, right? So if they don't match, you have issues over there. So over here, we've created 8 entries over here. So we'll just name this as values. It's a bit weird, I know, but we'll take it like that. So we also have that. So I will just duplicate this for the other ones. Change that a bit. Right. So once we've made them 8 in this case, I will now, so I'll just copy the attributes and then change them in the spinner. So we call them, I think, values and value labels. So I'll change the status to spinner select. Right. So form name spinner select. Select item. So you can see it's updated over there, right? So quite simple. So the checkbox also follows something similar, right? So perhaps there's an option that you'd want or things you want the user to agree to before the form can be submitted. That would be an ideal test case for a checkbox, right? So match parent wrap content. So on the label, will be in the text that is shown over there, right? So compulsory, or let's just call it mandatory option. Right, so this is required actually. So if you don't select it, you can't actually, move on. Okay, so I would use the checkbox entry to demonstrate the custom validators that you can also add, right? So we'll give the spinner an ID. We'll say select spinner, and then we would give this an ID of, I don't know, checkbox, right? And then finally, let's put a button there. So this button is basically for validation. I mean, submission of the form. Right, so submit. Right, so you can see all this content, especially the radio groups and the spinner, just created with these simple entries. Okay, so now that we have our XML ready, let's see how easy it is to perform validation in the activity. Right. So we'll head over to main activity. So I'll need references to my components. So I would first get all of them. So let's start with the edit text. So we would have the first name, last name, other names. And then we have the validatable radio group, marital status, select, or marital status. And the same for the spinner select, I believe we called it. And then the checkbox. So checkbox, right? So in my onCreate, I am going to get the references to these objects. So first, name input. Okay, and then we will change this to last name inputs, other name inputs, marital status select, spinner, and then checkbox. Yeah. Okay, so now that we have references to all the objects, let's work on the validation method. So essentially, this is what will connect to the button to perform validation for us, right? So validate. So view, right? So all these components extend the abstract class validatable view. Right. So that means if I need to collect all of them using one data type, I can use their superclass, which is the validatable view components is equal to new. So I can copy and paste all of them over there. And then paste. Okay. So now we have all our views. So the next thing is to simply say that we'll simply loop through all these components and tell them to validate. And if one of them fails to validate, we will just return from the function, right? So for validatable view, validatable of components. So if not validate, so we need to call validate from each of the components. So as you can see, right? So you can see that this validate takes in a hash map. So a hash map is basically key value, a storage for key value pairs. So we would create a hash map and then give it to each component. So if each component passes validation, it will put its key, being the form name, and then the value into this hash map for us, right? So we'll call these values. So go to new hash map. Right. So if any of them fails to validate, return from the function. And then we would actually launch. So let's put a to do here. So the last thing to do is connect this function to this button using the onClick attribute. And that is it. We have actually finished base validation or basic validation using the components, right? So let's see how this works on a device. So I'm going to use Visor to launch or to illustrate the functioning of these components. So I will play and then select my device from the list. So let's install it and then see how it works. Okay, so we have the application running on the device, right? So now let's see what happens when we just try to submit the form. So if I press or click submit, so immediately you can see that the validation has kicked in. Because first name failed to validate, it has shown the error message over there, and it didn't proceed to any of the components. So as to how the validation works, you can customize it the way you want to, right? Okay, so let's type in a value for first name, Kwame, and then try submitting again. So you can see the validation has kicked in again. Last name is not our last name. The error message for last name is showing. So I just have CD there. So remember, we didn't put any we didn't set other names to required. So that means even though I haven't typed in any value in, if I should now try to validate, voila, Validation has none. So no, none of them was giving us an error, right? So we didn't see any error message indicating that the submit or the validation is now complete. So all components have been validated, and most importantly, their values are now in the hash map, so we can retrieve them from it, right? Okay, so let's make a few changes to this application. So for one, we are going to put a custom validator on the checkbox, such that if you haven't selected this mandatory option, you cannot continue, right? So the component, each of the validatable components allows you to add your own validation to it. So note, if basic validation does not pass, that means your custom validator will never get called, right? Okay. So to make sure that it is validated, we are going to, yeah. So even though we set it to required, this checkbox is still returning a value. So it's returning a value of false, meaning that it hasn't been selected. But in case we wanted to ensure that you actually select it, we would add a custom component, sorry, custom validator to the checkbox. So checkbox dot add, sorry, set custom validator. So new custom validator. So you have to implement this on validate method. So you can see here the string here is basically the value that is currently in that component. So it will pass the value to the custom validator, and you can do anything you want to do. Right? So the custom validator returns a string. So if your validation passes, then you would want to return a null string to indicate that it has passed. Else you can return whatever error message you return here will be displayed under that particular component. Okay. So since it's going to return a string, I'll need to cast this to a boolean for the checkbox. So we'll use boolean.parse boolean s. Right. So if value, oh sorry, if not value, then we would return this field must be checked to continue. Else return now. Right. So as simple as that, you've added your custom validator. So let's run this application again and then see what happens. So we would go back to the application. Wait for it to restart. Okay. So we know that the first two fields are required, so let's fill them. Okay. So initially when we fill them and we press submit without checking the mandatory option, it actually submitted. But now if we press it, cool. You can now see that the text that we returned here is the same text that has been shown down here, right? So now if I check it and submit, the validation works again. Right? So you can see, very simple to implement. Okay, so we can see that this makes, simplifies the process of validation for us. Right, so let's work now on actually sending the data to another activity to be viewed. Right, okay, so let us work on that. So I'm going to create a new activity. And that activity is just going to have a single text view, right? That would simply show the value that is coming to it. So I would put text. I think this will be better in design mode. So I'll put a text view in the middle. So I would sync project again to get rid of this error. Yeah, okay. So I would set my constraints to match parent. Right. I will change the gravity option to center. Good. And I would, yeah. So the text has, so essentially whatever values come from the previous activity will be displayed in this text view, right? Okay. So after we've gotten our values, what we'll need to do is create an intent. So intent, new intent. We would put some data in our intent. So put extra, let's see, let's call it data. And then we'll take the values. Great. And then we will simply start the activity. Right? So we've created an intent, put the hash map values inside, and then we are sending it to the other activity. So over here, all I need to do is, first of all, get the intent. So I have to get the values out of it. So intent dot get extra. So we would use the key that we used over there, right? Okay. And then I simply have to find my text view in the XML. So view equals to find r.id.textView, right? And then what we need to do is I need to create a text out of this values object. So I'll use a string builder for that. So for string value in the values dot key set builder dot append the value itself. So this will be the key actually. Right. So builder dot append and then values dot get key. Right. And then the last thing I'll need to do is set the text views text. So set text to builder dot to string. Right. So let's build the application and see whether our attributes come with the activity or the intent, sorry. Okay, so let us see if it is the same thing. So we'll start with Kwame. We'll put in the last name there. And that. Right. So I will select something different from this. Okay, so we get an activity, crashing. So the reason being that I actually cannot pass the hash map directly. So what we will do to resolve that is we will rather build this string in the previous activity and then bring it to this activity instead, right? So I will copy this string builder implementation and then put it in the main activity over here. So we will also append a new line to it. And I will rather send the string into the next activity. So in the view activity, we will no longer be using a hash map, but it will just be a string. So we'll get string extra rather. So we'll take all this out and then simply set the values. So this is unnecessary. Okay. So I hope you understood why the error was there. Or at least that's not the right way to pass in a hash map into another string. Sorry, another activity. So we just converted it into a string here and rather sent it to the activity. Right? So we'll build this again and hopefully this would work. Okay, so let's try again. So we'll put Kwame as you do and Opare. So I'll leave this, select a different option from this, select this and then submit. Okay, so we are still getting an error. So let's actually see what the error is. Oh, right. Wow, I totally forgot. In the intent, we never specified the targets. So we need to specify that we are coming from this activity into the view activity dot class. Wow, I am so sorry for that. Okay, so now this should work. At least I hope it will work, but I'm pretty sure it's going to work. So perhaps we were actually passing the hash map, just that because of this we weren't able to get, but all the same, it should still work. So let's wait for it to install. Okay, so we are up and running. So we will try this one last time. So Kwame, as you do, and Opare. So I will select a different option, check this, and yeah, as you can see, we have our data over there. Oops, sorry. So it says last names as you do, first names Kwame, the spinner select, marital status single, and other names Opare. So success, we have working validation and data collection, right? So yeah, that's basically the whole video. I'd encourage you to get it. It's still a work in progress, so I'd encourage you to please get it, use it. If you have any issues, please file a report on my or raise an issue on my GitHub repo, and I will do well to address those. So if you also think of any interesting features or things you think we might that can improve, please let me know. I'm ready to listen and then work on those. Right? Okay. So yeah, that's basically what this video is about. So if you please comment, subscribe, like, to get notifications of future videos. And please comment. I will respond to those comments if you are having any difficulties or any other related issues. Okay, so until we meet again, have a nice day and happy coding.